great pleasure to welcome you all today to this webinar lecture series. Today's event is conducted by the Padma Bhushan Professor N.R. Madhavan Menon Chair on Legal Education. In our presence today, we are very humbled and delighted to have an esteemed legal academician, Professor Dr. Shashikala Gurpur, Director of Symbiosis Law School Pune and Dean of Symbiosis International University. I now invite our beloved teacher, Dr. Jijimon V.S. Sir, who's always very eager to provide the best learning opportunities to his students to give the welcome address.
Thank you, Krishna. Good afternoon, one and all. Respected Madam Shashikala Gurpur, my director, Reverend Father Koshi, Isaac Punamotil, my principal, Dr. John PC, my vice principals, Tom Soti sir and Ramanda sir, my teachers, colleagues, and dear students. It's a very personal honor and delightful moment for me that I'm heading the activity in the chair, which is in the name of my teacher, my guide, with whom I have a very close relationship, not as a very personal relationship too, Professor N.R. Madhav Menon. And you, as all know, that he is called as the father of modern legal education in India, and is also said to be the teacher of teachers, judges who taught many judges who are many lawyers, eminent scholars, and architect of the modern legal education system and the law school movement in India. He had a very close relationship with the Margaguris College of Law, and to be precise, he was the he gave the inaugural lecture for the first batch students of the Margaguris College of Law. Thereafter, he had been a regular teacher to this institution whenever he was not busy with his schedule in Trivandrum. He held a position of a honorary emeritus professor of this college. And later, the college, recognizing and remembering the great soul, established this chair in his name, called Professor N.R. Madhav Menon Chair on Legal Education. And this chair takes up the activities of promoting legal education to take forward his vision and ideology of how the legal education system of to be in this present scenario. And reflecting those vision, the chair holds many activities, including the lecture series, and another one of the important activities is the open forum, where the students are being given opportunity to discuss the latest legal issues and express their viewpoints, etc. Now, it's an honor and privilege that we have amongst us a teacher who has been one of the disciple of Professor N.R. Madhav Menon. Got a very chance in the very initial years of her career to be part of the National Law School Bangalore, where she got the training directly from the teacher Professor N.R. Madhav Menon. Madam, personally, it's an honor for me because to start with the activity when I am heading, I'm taking over charge of the chair. I thought no other person could better suit the lecture series beginning than you, ma'am. And on behalf of the Margaguris College of Law, I wholeheartedly welcome and thank you for accepting in the very first message that I dropped to you for delivering this lecture. On behalf of my students, I welcome you, ma'am, and I also welcome my director, who is always the source and inspiration for all the activities that happens in the college. My principal, Professor Dr. John PC, and the vice principals and teachers to this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As law students, we are all very eager to understand and learn how to become the best lawyer we can. And Professor Dr. Shashikala Gurpur is here with us virtually to shine a light on these various aspects. The topic for today's webinar is concept, comparison, strategy, synergy of development lawyering. Professor Dr. Shashikala Gurpur is an accomplished academician, passionate researcher, Toastmaster, and a Fulbright scholar. She holds a PhD in international law from the University of Mysore, Karnataka State Government Award, Gold Medal for topping in LLM, and was the AHRB Visiting Fellow, Edinburgh Law School, UK 2004. She has had an impressive career with a wide range of impactful experience in teaching, research, NGO, and industry. Dr. Shashikala Gurpur is the recipient of several distinct honors, awards, and recognition for her contribution in legal education, gender sensitization, and community outreach program. In recognition of her contributions to the Indian legal academia, she was listed in the book 100 Legal Luminaries of India by LexisNexis. Dr. Gurpur has been recently conferred with the prestigious Kritu Rani Chennamma Award by the Government of Karnataka in 2018 for her work towards empowerment of women. Dr. Shashikala Gurpur was a member of the 19th Law Commission of India and is currently a member on the Curriculum Development Committee. She has been continuing with Symbiosis Law School since 2007 and is the director of Symbiosis Law School Pune and the dean of Symbiosis International University. I now invite Professor Dr. Shashikala ma'am to kindly take over the session.
Good afternoon, respected Director Sir, Principal Sir, my dear colleague Dr. Jijimon, and all of you who are present remotely and proximately to the Mar Gregorius College. First of all, my respectful tribute to the great noble soul of Dr. Madhav Menon, who I think if we believe in our philosophy of India, who remains immortalized as a spirit who represents various qualities. But most of all, I still remember in 2017 when we held the Global Law Deans Meet in Symbiosis, we were the chosen venue, and we honored 10 law gurus, senior-most law gurus who were nanogenarians and octogenarians, and Dr. Menon sir was one of them. I remember his brief speech where he said, if I had another life, I would be born as a law teacher. And we never thought that that very thought of another life. That time we thought maybe 10 years later, sir should be speaking about this. Why is sir speaking like this? I think to some degree, he was sending a message to rest of us that whatever you are, whether judge or lawyer or anything, there is no big accomplishment than being a great law teacher. So the students and the teachers who are here, I think one of the ways in which we can live the spirit of Professor Menon's life is that we believe we are gurus of justice and law in whatever pursuit we follow. So with my greatest reverence and respect for that soul, and also gratitude to the Mar Gregorius College for institutionalizing the very first chair in India in his name, and Professor Jijimon with the proper merit leading that chair, having lived with Dr. Menon for very long, breathing his spirit and sharing his spirit and doing a lot of hard work with sir. We held, I think Jijimon led the whole conceptualization and implementation of many faculty development initiative, lawyer development initiative to mention a few among all the initiatives that sir had taken. So with those fond memories, let me share my ideas on the theme chosen for today. I don't want to spend too much time on why did we choose this. There is a reason for choosing this. The reason is very simple, that the last meeting we had with the, or one of the last training programs, I don't know if Jijimon remembers it well, was when we were in Kalinga Kids Law School, where Dr. Menon had this innovative idea he was very passionate about lawyering skills, very structured lawyering skills to be imparted to students. And the one which was very close to his heart was development lawyering. So the very idea of development lawyering was brought in. He had given some broad snippets for the curriculum, but very many law schools, I don't know how they have conceived, they would have conceived it as equivalent to community lawyering, or they would have conceived it equivalent to development related projects and the legal needs to be met in those cases as part of the legal clinic in several colleges which are situated in this area. So I thought that some of the in-house conception we have had of this My experience in terms of sharing the ethos, passion, and let us say collegial moments with Dr. Menon, whether it was with National Law School of India, University Bangalore, or later when he came and inaugurated Symbiosis's first community law clinic in 2008 in Pirangoot village, or whether it was a question of Sir giving ideas to the government as well to make law and the entire gamut of rule of law with its various bucket list of justice system, lawyer training, or legal education to vibrate to the developmental setting that India is. So I thought this could be the most apt way of kickstarting the activities of the chair, so to speak, and also to pay honorable, meaningful tribute to the departed soul. So let me take a few minutes to share my very fortunate moments with Dr. Madhav Menon sir. First of all, our meeting was, I think I always feel that there are certain things in our life which are divine design. I was brought up in a very rural home, in a very traditional home. My mother migrated from Kerala, my mother's ancestors. My father came from Mangalore. So we had a village home from where I was doing up and down in my law degree days. Took my master's from Mysore and came and joined the same law college in Mangalore where I graduated from SDM Law College. It was in the faculty room of SDM Law College that Dr. Madhav Menon was hosted by our senior faculty members. And Sir came with the idea of engaging this private law college, which was one and the only in Mangalore city. And he also said that since the law college is sponsored by a temple, a very famous temple trust, that they should also look at sponsoring the cause of quality legal education. So in that meeting, Sir proposed the idea of a community-based legal reform initiative on worker women, which was an all India level competition for law students. So nobody took initiative. I was the only lady faculty. Of course, I had a senior lady colleague also, but I was the one who was pushed to do that because I was fresh LLM graduate. So when I picked that up, I had no clue of socio-legal research because I was trained in a black letter law research, very comfortable with collecting case laws, analyzing the case laws, and then trying to look at doctrinal research in the way we think that that is a superior type of research, a very Puritan kind of approach to law research. So the whole paradigm shift happened with that meeting and with that research in my life. So Dr. Menon's life for me has been like the life, if I may compare in utmost respect, like the life of Adi Shankara, that some of such people are born who always are programmed. I'm going to give a quote at the end from an American jurist who carry that message throughout their life. Dr. Menon's life, the way he lived, the way he gathered people, the way he touched lives without telling that he is interested in their development. And it is not a development where he would see them as individuals. He would see them as instruments to fulfill the mission of justice education. So this was the kind of impression and this was the kind of influence I received from Dr. Madhav Menon. And within a year, he invited me to join the faculty in National Law School. And thereafter, it was a kind of, I was there, working there for a year. I met an Irish law professor and we decided to marry. And at that time also, it was Dr. Menon's liberal idea, non-interfering approach, utmost respect for women. And most of all, we loved his love for his wife. He was always concerned more about his wife's well-being more than his own. So these are some of the areas where we felt I did not go much deeper into his personal side because Dr. Menon was always like a bitter pill. To taste the sugar in the pill, you have to first go through the bitterness. So that bitterness in the sense that it was not really bitterness. There was an ocean of love in the heart in that personality. But that love was always placed in the mission. The mission was quality legal education, being a good teacher, good researcher. First thing he told me was organize yourself. Aim at very high quality in teaching and research. I mean, it is a kind of guru mantra for me, even when I meet my new students or new teachers. And Dr. Menon's induction addresses were something that I could never forget. And he would come and handhold the teachers, new teachers who are joined. Sometimes the bitterness would be in the form of his very dominating, authoritative way of telling what he wanted to say without being interrupted. But it was also something that gave us a kind of anchoring in a very commanding, convincing, authentic personality. The motivation, I was always wondering, where is the motivation coming from? He was a kind of enigma because when I saw Sir with that kind of walking alone with that authority, I thought he must be coming from a very authoritative family. You know, normally people who have political backing, who have bureaucratic backing in the family circle behave like that. But to my utter dismay, I really got to know Dr. Menon after I became the dean of this college in 2008. In 2007, I became the dean. Within 3 months, I had invited Sir because for us, being a law teacher without Menon Sir's philosophy is like being in the world without oxygen. So we invited him, and the first workshop he took was on clinical legal teaching. All my young faculty were very new to the exposure, and Dr. Menon, till the end of his life, continued to be our board of studies member, our advisor, our mentor, our guru, and personally for me, he has been a father figure as well. So this is how I would recall my moment with him. So I left India in 1998. By 2004, when I came back, Dr. Menon was already with his innovation in public service. He was already there in the Criminal Justice Reforms Commission of Government of India. He had finished one stint with the Law Commission of India as a full-time member. He had already established NUJS Calcutta, and he was on his venture to establish the first judicial academy of the country. So Sir's motivation, his clarity, he wouldn't waste time in thinking of what we call in thinking hats, the black, the negative. It was always about his idea and the way to execute the idea. So the power of ideas, the power of his clear intention. I always saw a person who was a very good combination, harmonious combination of Gyan, Bhakti and Karma. By Bhakti, I don't mean Bhakti in the sense of just Nam Jap or something, but Bhakti in the sense of devotion to the mission. So in many ways, he was an Atimanush, he was a superhuman. And without showing the care, he really cared for everybody. And he was adventurous, but balancing his role as a husband, as a father, as a dedicated citizen of this country, a patriot. So with my respectful memories and homage to that departed soul, I seek your permission to continue with the theme. So development lawyering, as I already told you, the very source is Dr. Menon Sir's very proposed clinical legal curriculum, legal skills curriculum. So development lawyering as a 2-credit course, we have incorporated in our curriculum since last year. And many other law schools would have adopted it either as a workshop or as a short skills component to the students. I have not done any official survey, but I'm sure that there were about 10 law deans that day and a number of law teachers from all over the country. Many would have definitely taken the initiative to incorporate it into their curriculum. So first of all, when you look at the word development and the word lawyering, the first thought that comes to everybody's mind is the idea of development. The entire development debate, which is controversial in some sense because development has always been seen as what they call as fulfillment of material purpose, having electrified house or a good roof on the head or good quality nutrition. So we always looked at material indicators of development. It was only with the Human Development Index developed by Maqbool Hasan and also United Nations institutionalization of that in the UNDP, in the Millennium Development Goals, and also now Sustainable Development Goals, which have come to substitute, take forward the Millennium Development Goal, where the core principles such as access to justice, gender equality, elimination of poverty have been some areas where justice has a close fit with. So development debate, when it neatly sits with the idea of justice and realization of that justice as a precondition for human happiness and precondition for the pursuit of happiness by every human being and the entire humanity, then I think development is not just about material attainment. So as a lawyer, or law as a system, law as a behavioral framework, And law as a means to justice has to encounter the threats to such conditions of justice, and it has to encounter injustice in every way. Therefore, engaging with the law in that critical, evaluative fashion is the lawyering approach that is required in the context of development. So, splitting development and lawyering, if one were to see, our predominant idea of development and our predominant idea of lawyering, development as in material sense, lawyering as in court-centric, judicial system and litigation system-centric approach need to be critically unpacked. They need to be what we call as deconstructed. Therefore, it is about the incorporation of socioeconomic and political context of law in practice or in the theory of legal practice that needs to be incorporated. So here, the practice of law, I have referred this as scholars writing, Yale University scholars writing, Munir, where it is talked about being a collaborative legal practice, where we use, as the case may be, organizations of people like non-governmental organizations, trade unions, and it's a kind of practice which is not simply confined with the national boundaries. We draw inspiration, we draw strategies and approaches from transnational context, and sometimes we may even look at incorporating Article 21's articulation of right to life as right to livelihood. For example, and the idea of Human Development Index looking at justice and access to justice, unmet legal needs, being also incorporated in Article 21 again, and Article 22, Article 20. So Lok Adalat is one such dimension, job fairs, which are now we are holding a job fair where we are not looking at only providing employment to these construction and other unorganized labor, but we are looking at educating them about various rights and negotiating with their employers on how to protect these rights by implementing these schemes. It costs nothing to them. They may have to spare a few personal hours to implement these schemes in the context of these unorganized moving population. So this is how our law school has looked at it. And another initiative as legal researchers, some of us are little armchair researchers. We do not want to engage in community legal service or legal services authority activity. I should say that our faculty, 80% of them have sat as panelists when these Lok Adalats were being conducted, along with working judges. And some of them who are into armchair research and students who are reluctant to go to the community and find out, we have put a practice in action, which is at least 100 stakeholders for a PhD and at least 50 stakeholders for a master's dissertation have to be met before you write your conclusion chapter in your research. So community-based law reform and a proposal for reforming the law, either to change the law or to look at a new legislation or to look at new ways of strengthening through rules and regulations, is something that comes out of such exercise. Needless to say that this is an original research, unlike the doctrinal research, which is where creating an original proposition takes much of experience and reading. We have seen here that primary data, which is brought through community-based law reform exercise, validates this research to be published in very well-known journals. So basically, with this background, if you see, development lawyering as a strategy and as a concept can be explored further. That is my little attempt here. So development lawyering, as Munir himself has validated, is always about that negotiation of power. I can give you two examples. When a woman complains about domestic violence and takes action or takes that first step to approach a lawyer or approach an NGO to share her agony and confusion, whether she is perceiving it as violence, whereas it is supposed to be a happy marriage, then is the first step that is taken is challenging that power equation within the household, in the private sphere. When somebody who is living in the urban space of a big city thinks that they are very privileged to be in that city, but they are living in the slum which is recreating of the poverty or the rural space, then there is a negotiation of power. When they ask that question, they are trying to challenge that power and the given. So it is here that even the collaboration needs to be very critically viewed. Therefore, one of the ways in which we engaged in research was we always looked at in terms of taking students to the community and making students assimilate that community's reality, and then keeping that clinical distance as a researcher without compromising the truth, but at the same time being very sensitive to the community in terms of honoring their aspiration, etc. So ethical compliances also are something that need to be in the background. So today there is a breed of lawyers emerging from United Kingdom and other developed parts of the world, where these lawyers are organizing as lawyers working with global poverty. Now, these lawyers may be mediated through international NGOs or through church groups or any other kind of global agenda, and then they are looking at law as a force which enables justice, disables injustice or inroads into justice. And here the concern has mostly been in terms of accountability in case of those international development projects, or looking at urban poverty. Like in India itself, we have had Greenpeace initiatives in looking at all those nuclear projects to be more accountable to the local community. This will also come in the, I mean, it can neatly align with corporate social responsibility with those big companies, institutional social responsibility with big universities, which are to be accountable to the neighboring community, because none of us can grow stronger without the rest of us making those compromises or sacrifices. We have had examples of IMAC, a New York-based NGO, which has looked at pre-grant opposition to generic medicines. We have had researchers coming from parts of the world where remittance assistance by law students to the migrant Indians or migrant international people like Hispanics has taken place. Currently, there have been law students and other students and youth groups and non-governmental organizations working as COVID warriors. We had seen in Pune COVID warriors in two levels. One is healthcare workers going from door to door and identifying cases including violence against children or domestic violence. It was during COVID period. During COVID period, facilitating migrants by writing the record of where they are going and providing them with basic minimum support till they reach home. COVID warriors in the post-COVID period, identifying vaccination, needy people for vaccination who are not able to afford vaccination and providing financial support, or who could afford vaccination but could not come to the vaccination venue, and they were in a very vulnerable group with the aged or mentally challenged people. So some of our legal aid services team have identified these in the neighboring households and have taken these wheelchair-bound people to the center, or have taken the vaccination to their doorstep with sufficient support system available. We also have instances of how people who have lost their enterprise, who have lost their businesses, for them trade adjustment benefit by intervening with the loaning banks and things like that. Social security schemes, as I gave you the example, have been made available. Such initiatives have happened during the global downturn in the developed countries. Those models could be taken as best practice, and some of them we have experimented with successfully, although in a small pocket in our own location. Now, one of the hold all kind of term which we use is human rights. Now, whether human rights can't be used as the alternative term here, why did Dr. Menon coin this word development lawyering? Now, there is sufficient theoretical and scholarly work which is showing that there needs to be a shift from the hold all kind of human rights framework to developmental framework. Because human development as such is a very different dimension. It has had its own ideology and history, right to human development as one of the human rights. But when we are looking at development as such, it's not simply about right to development in terms of facilities, it is about one's freedom. Therefore, at that level, human rights can be equivalent to development, but not every human rights. The limitation with human rights discourse is that, you all will agree with me, that bringing human rights to non-state based instances of injustice could be a challenge, like in case of domestic violence or women's human rights. Bringing human rights to a non-trivialized context could be different, because family violence is trivialized. Or what kind of strategy do we use in such cases, where we have to look at all-round development of the individual in terms of internal autonomy, in terms of capacity to think, capacity to be free. Therefore, it is here that development lawyering is a kind of encounter. It is a kind of direct encounter with the given idea of practice. It is going from subjectivity of those who are providing this lawyering service and subjectivity of those who are availing these lawyering services to the idea of mutuality. I will give you an example that when in Mangalore refinery and petrochemicals were established, beautiful, fertile agrarian lands were acquired. And those who were landlords, they had enough legal evidences to support their claims. But then there were those who were dependent on those lands. And when we had documented with our students the documentation through the form of a small film, one of the ladies who was totally illiterate spent half an hour with us, and she told us about how her ancestors have been serving these agricultural families as a daily wage labor. But there have been a lot of mutual relationship in terms of being of help to each other. Yet she cannot think of the trees being cut, because it was the tree which had heard her sorrows when she lost her child, when she lost her husband. So what we cannot translate in legal documentation, how do we make it a point of equity, is still a challenge. That is where from subjectivity it has to move to mutuality, where it is not your idea of rights and justice alone, it's a composite idea of rights and justice in that given ecosystem. So it is where development lawyering gives that kind of insight to action. I will tell you the strategies in gender cases that we have used many times through non-governmental organizations, where we had used our lawyering sense, our idea of rights and justice when we try to give a fair hearing, and trusting the person who is initially trusting giving that feeling of trust to open up. And then we would document that experience of pain, and we would shift that to the therapy session, and then create the group of these people in the sense of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, where those women will come together every month and they will discuss the strategies which they had used to cope with this loss or pain of the family situation. And it was in those situations that many of these women became what we call as, they were expunging or communicating their pain and getting rid of it, and taking the first step to look at themselves as empowered being. So this journey from pain to empowerment is beyond the law. It is beyond the subjectivity or beyond their definition as right holders in the law. So there is a lot of mutuality that needs to be coming in between disciplines when we are looking at development lawyering. The other question is the lawyer-client connect to this kind of development lawyering situations and strategies, is it only to be representing in a clinical sense, or is it also to destabilize the power influence and to equalize that power relationship? One such example is the remittances to India. Kerala is home to large number of migrants, and you have a research center there. Dr. Menon used to speak about Mr. Irudayarajan's various researches and reports, which we also make use of in our study on migrant rights. So if you look at India's GDP, almost 15 to 20% of money flows through this kind of overseas remittances. There was a very interesting parallel between this and the New Haven initiative, which was taken up in New York. It was about how people who are remitting to their homes, whether Indians or Hispanic population and others, how do you help, or African population, how do you help them? Because they were using these money laundering, so-called money laundering channels and other channels. So giving them ideas about the consequences of remitting and the risks involved, and then educating them on how legal remittances can happen, and giving them knowledge, even helping them to fill the forms, which we do here in many cases in the legal aid clinic, is an increased opportunity for transparency, for low cost, and for correct impact without any kind of risk. Similarly, those instances which I told you about MSMEs and others who are impacted to be compensated. In the US, it happened many a times, and at that time, it was these law schools which were engaged. Now, the other one comes from the approach of the World Bank and its confrontation, or the confrontation of the local community with the projects which are sponsored by World Bank. We have had these instances which came in Narmada Bachao Andolan. We have had consumerist approach many a times of these projects rather than participatory approach. Questions on who led these movements and how did they represent will give you the answer of some of these non-governmental formations, which were very, very democratic, which were bringing those unheard voices. For example, Gujarat's Self-Employed Women's Association, which won the Raymond Magsaysay Award under the leadership of Ela Bhatt, was showing how a trade union for street vendors, particularly women, was making a lot of sense. Now, what we see in India is that still large part of India is underdeveloped, or it is on the verge of being developed. And here the idea of lawyering is not just law-centric, court-centric approach. It is an approach which needs to be looked at from the point of view of deeper engagement of lawyers, deeper engagement of law students. So when we are conceptualizing and comparing the very idea which I started with, development vis-a-vis human rights, and development and human rights and lawyering, they are intersecting, and they are also sometimes alternative to each other. So here, one of the approaches, one of the foremost lawyers of human rights in private sector, Philip Alston, he talks about how there needs to be a convergence and divergence in terms of approach, in terms of right to development as a human right and progressive realization of socioeconomic rights. Now, skeptics talk about that in countries like India, because India, as a developing nation, is given that kind of option in the socioeconomic and cultural human rights dimension of the covenant, where we are supposed to have progressive realization. Recently, I was listening to Prime Minister's address, Foundation Day lecture for National Human Rights Commission, where Prime Minister was showing the data in terms of how human rights realization and governmental schemes are neatly aligning. Very interesting analysis in terms of how governance is trying to be responsive, how governance is bringing that awareness. I mean, this was the idea that Dr. Menon used to always discuss, rule of law in the center of governance. Today, if you look at governance, the governance has been more on the economics driven and economic statistics based governance, economics output based governance. Now, a time has come for us in terms of looking at center of governance, or these institutions, think tanks, to look at governance with rule of law. Because if you look at developed countries, the backbone is the rule of law, where the law is clearly reflecting and indicating the progressive surge of those nations, and the law is strictly implemented. There is a consensus among the population, general population, that the outreach of the law has been so strong that population participates and it very carefully complies with the law. Now, that is something that we need to bring in. And here what we see is socioeconomic and cultural human rights, fortunately now are being shown, whether it is the issue of triple talaq or it is the issue of how stimulus package is being introduced to the economy. There is a desire in the governing milieu. How it is reaching also has got a lot of other issues. We saw also the initiative in Kerala in terms of governor himself and the chief minister making a lot of effort in terms of addressing the domestic violence increasing frequency. Now, in the neoliberal, market-centric, multinational corporations driven reality, where are these capabilities approaches or human rights based approaches converging or diverging? In terms of reaction to the neoliberal, thinkers who are from the third world approaches to international law talk about how when you look at globally, there are only two classes, the transnational capital class and the transnational oppressed class. The capital class, which has concentration of 91% of the wealth, and the oppressed class, where large percentage of population, almost 90% of the population, lives on a very meager kind of daily earning. It is here that the giving pledge and other dimensions of sustainable development goal are slowly being practiced in building the consensus, in volunteering, etc. So here, development needs to be seen beyond economic growth. So just economic growth is not indicator of development because it may again get concentrated in the hands of the few. Therefore, there needs to be an understanding that development and human rights need not be similar. They are not the same. They may have overlaps, yet development in terms of equitable development, it's equitable distribution of dividends across the population, accountability in the institutions to make it effective and to ensure the growth in equitable dividend to the population of the outcome of development, where policy development needs to be based on data is the need of the hour. Now, how does lawyering come here? How does law come here? As an instrumentality. We need not use human rights argument here because human rights pitches individual or entity against the state. Now we have to go beyond, as we said, transnational capital class and transnational oppressed class, because capital is moving in a way that state in some ways has conceded the space, or state in some ways, a strong word would be state in some ways has been a nanny state. It has been playing a second fiddle to this whole onward march of too much concentration of wealth, which is resulting in a kind of challenge to equity. So it is here that methodological pluralism of law means not just concentrating on doctrinal research, but plural approaches, methodological pluralism in lawyering, and a kind of law indifferent means which rule you are following is not important. Maybe the strategy you follow, use the existing framework, but you try to make visible the claims of those who need, who deserve that development. And we need to shift in this case from human rights framework to development framework, because it is in the human rights framework that the agency and the self-determination of those who are really in need, whose needs are unmet, which remains invisible. I hope I have made it very clear. Now, how do you make them empowered? How do you make that segment, which is the transnational oppressed class or which is invisible class, how do you give them the controlling capacity? How do you elicit solution, which is a solution coming from them? I will give you an example. When we were working with Karnataka's legislator, Dr. Jayamala, on the female sex workers of Karnataka's status report, we were, I mean, as researchers, you know, we were given the mandate to look at 4 different types of status. One was how the sex work was, where it was happening, what kind of income was there, what kind of socioeconomic exploitation, what kind of context fed this, what kind of rights violation happened in case of health, in case of legal system. One of the most tragic things was that 45% of these people came as sex workers before they were of mature age. That means 45% human trafficking as child trafficking. Now, when we were looking at this status, we also were focusing on what could be the solution. So sex workers' own organizations were there, thanks to the Melinda Gates Foundation initiative in the wake of HIV/AIDS. We built on that because that had given a platform for them to come together. And we were in our wishful thinking based on statistics that What these women wanted was a house to live with dignity and some kind of income, and then some kind of dignified another job designation or their own entrepreneurship. Now, one of the challenges for us as lawyers that we saw was challenge to dignity in terms of the stigmatization. So we thought giving them dignity with a job opportunity and income for independence alongside other huge budgeted social welfare various schemes could be the panacea for this, for those who are willing to leave. 90% of them did not want to continue in this. This is another interesting statistics. But what we found in this statistics as policy priority, we thrashed it out in case studies. The priorities still remain the same, although the emphasis shifted between these three in terms of dignity with new designations, in terms of housing, and in terms of them being freed by giving this entrepreneurship opportunity. You will be surprised to know when we put them in a focus group discussion and we tried to verify, because all these data came through different ways, direct, indirect, etc. In the focus group discussion, and after that secondary level statistical analysis, what came priority was that we thought they needed a house first, because for us house was associated with dignity and autonomy. What they said was that they wanted their economic means as designated as somebody else. They needed a different job designation, being given new sets of skills to start a new life with the new designation. That means dignity comes first. With the dignity, interwoven was autonomy, and then it was housing. So what we think in armchair is different from the policy priority of those who don't or who didn't have the capacity to participate in the lawmaking or to participate in terms of deciding the policy priority. Therefore, when the law is looking at human needs approach, there is a synergy, and that synergy is in this community lawyering. Many a times we look at community legal surveys, community lawyering, which is with our legal aid clinics, we have to look at beyond silos in terms of political justice, economic justice, and social justice. We have to look at cause lawyering in that particular cause. So here, that particular community's right to participate is very important. Community-based law reform is not just us going for namesake to the community. We have to unlearn, Dr. Menon used to say, unlearn, learn the law, and then relearn in the light of the experience that you have had. Our elite students were made to enter the muddied waters of the agrarian fields in Dakshin Kannada district in the 90s. Today, our students have gone and seen Gauran lands, community lands, cow grazing lands, and the farmers who are living in the vicinity and what their aspiration is. Or they would have met these women who are in need of children, who don't have their own children, who want to adopt, and the rigid process in the CARA guidelines. So this feel, this empathy, which is the driving force beyond artificial intelligence or computers, comes when you engage in the community. So based on that, we can have better understanding of these so-called development institutions like World Bank, because we are looking at what the ground reality is. So these institutions look at development as improvement in the material condition, whereas the reality on the ground, these women did not want house first. We thought they want house first. What they wanted was dignity. It was freedom. It was the capacity to go and walk with their children to the neighboring market and buy things, than being called all those painful names, stigmatized identity. So priority is known to them better than us. And if we sit in our armchair and we think that is development for them, that's not going to be a good development approach. That is the development lawyering approach, which is very critical of the given truths, which is investigating truths from the experience of the community and empowering them as the agency and as the people with autonomy. Therefore, it is people-centric approach of the poor, of the marginalized, of the vulnerable. If you look at Legal Aid Services Authority Act of India, you will definitely agree that more than 85% of the people are coming within the definition of vulnerable or those who are susceptible to harm. So It is this process of human needs approach in law has synergy with development lawyering by being a process of self-empowerment of those who lack that voice, those who do not have the power. Therefore, in terms of synergy, lawyering as an approach could be a choice between two. One is top-down approach, which Weber and all argued, where government has to be clean, it has to be structured, justice system being structured, proper financial aid being given. Okay, the books show that this much budgetary allocation has been made, this much spend has been there. But how did they spend? Where did it reach? What difference did it make? Is something. And that is where, with the government, a co-regulation or collaboration. That's why community lawyering and development lawyering as an approach is about professionalism of a lawyer. That's why we say development and lawyering. So approach to development as capability, as freedom, approach to development as making difference in every individual's life by being autonomous, with the lawyering as a strategy, has a synergy. Now, what is that synergy? What does lawyering represent? Lawyering represents professionalism. There's a structured way of orientation and training. There is an objective, impartial way because of the training of looking at the reality. Second is being client-centric, not self-centric. It is the client who dictates. Third, lawyer's profession is about problem solving. So problem solving has got phases. One is identifying the problem, gathering the information, generating solution, not only solution from you, that would be more of a patronizing approach, but a democratic lawyering approach is what do they want, and then strategizing your solution by evaluating what they want, what the law gives, or what you advise with your training, and then deciding and implementing. So it's a kind of multifactorial analysis. It's a kind of weighing between options, making a very strong, very careful, informed choice. So this is what Grameen Bank of Bangladesh did with microcredit approach to women, which later resulted in a big bank. We have in Andhra also such successful experiments. This is what they did when intellectual property rights regime was emerging out of WTO. Some of the countries which were not visibly competitors to the dominant Japanese or American side came out with their own innovative in-house or within-country solutions, from being static to lawyering approach, where professionalism, client centricity, problem solving, I would also say it is not only identifying problem, also identifying opportunity. For example, the way in which we are bringing many traditional knowledge into the domain of IP. So it is about pursuing the knowledge globally, thinking globally, looking at global approaches and best practices, but deriving local solutions. So it is in order to empower women, it is in order to empower everybody to get the rich dividends of trade or projects and progress. So I have already given you the examples. So with this, I would like to conclude by pointing to the attention, once again coming back to the magnanimous personality of Dr. Menons, that is a bitter pill, which is not a sugar-coated pill, but a bitter pill. Is it really without care? No, there is a lot of care in that bitter pill. So my tribute to him as a law guru in Justice Action talks in terms of the quotation from John A. Powell, who was talking about racing justice. He was a judge. And it is more or less like the work of Dr. Menon and our own understanding now of development lawyering as an approach is about that kind of love let loose in justice work. Now, how does love get let loose in justice work? What kind of personality or what kind of approach is required by law researchers, law students, judges, and lawyers? I would like to begin the quote of John A. Powell. I quote, "Highly attuned seekers and leaders have the ability to see across categories and to recognize the importance of bringing love into even the most potentially mathematical equations. They also," and he was referring to Martin Luther King, they also, I think especially of Dr. King, place themselves in service to more than caring for those in pain. They also place themselves in service to the public face of love. that is justice, and they call upon each and all of us to do the same. Unquote. Thank you very much for this opportunity. We can have a discussion if there is a kind of interest in the audience. If there's any concept that needs clarity, that could be explained. Thank you one and all for this wonderful opportunity. And once again, my respectful, revered tributes to Dr. Menon.